So actually, I wanted to start with something that is a slightly random topic, which is, so after I talked to Michael Hornberger on this podcast, he asked me basically whether he should set me in contact with other people, introduce me to other people who might want to be guests. And I said I wanted to invite you next. And he said, "Oh yeah, you can contact Hugo. I don't need to introduce you though. Just send him an email, and like within like 4 hours, he'll say yes. He's super good with email." And I thought, okay, let's try this out. So I sent you an email at I think like 11 a.m. or something. Went for lunch. Still hadn't received an email. I thought, okay, let's see. And then within, just before the 4 hour mark, you responded to my email. So I was like, okay, Michael knows you well. I'm just curious, how do you? Yeah, I mean, we've also had to basically mail back and forth a bit because we changed the recording date and that kind of stuff. And you've always been very quick. How do you do that? Because from what I've heard, professors get lots and lots of email, and lots of stuff to do. And most people are a lot slower. So how do you do that?
Yeah, you just get into the practice of literally having to just hammer them out quickly because you don't have that time. And there's that classic sort of idea that professors typically either respond immediately or a year later is one of the two.
Yeah.
And that's what I find. It's really tricky that you'll have a bit of a dialogue maybe, and someone asks something, maybe takes a bit more thought, and you never get that follow-up email quickly back. So managing dialogue with people is a real trick, I think. But yeah, I do spend a fair bit of my time when I look at what is it I do as a professor. It is a lot of emailing because I'm providing feedback, I'm commenting, I'm pushing things forward, I'm requesting or often responding to people about things. And it's, people sort of go, "Oh, I remember Michael actually saying, what did you do?" He said, like, discussed, "What did you do today? Did you get work done or did you just email all day?" And it's that kind of feeling that it's quite nice when you actually are not emailing back and forwards. But yeah, so much of it happens.
So how do you then manage that? Or like, do you mind that? Or is it more, I don't know.
It's frustrating at times, definitely, managing it, because you think, oh gosh, I really better reply to these set of emails, but I don't actually physically have the time today. So what I do is flag things. I keep a zero, like I don't have any sitting there. I just flag things I've got to respond to, and then go back through all the flagged email as soon as I can. But yeah, there's a fair few I don't respond to because I don't need to. But yeah, it's hard. It's a general challenge. I'm sure other people have way better. Some people are extremely efficient. I'm not one of these uber efficient people. But it's no doubt
put in the time doing it. Okay, so yeah, I don't know whether you've heard of Cal Newport. He's had a few books. He's a professor of computer science, but at Georgetown University. But he's, I think, publicly a lot more known for his like productivity books, and because he, I think, basically he wrote a book called A World Without Email. I think he doesn't have any social media and all that kind of stuff, and but as like a computer scientist who's working on this stuff, and I don't know, like he suggests like using Slack or whatever as an alternative. I've never actually used that, so I don't know. I think I'm not really in the demographic that has email problems yet as a PhD student, but yeah, I was just curious how you kind of okay, so it is just a bit of a slog.
It is a slog, and I think it's the flagging, that a capacity to flag emails and go back to those ones that are flagged. It would never work. That's the only way. I definitely find that. Other people have other strategies, I'm aware, but for me that works. But yeah, it's a lot of email. Okay. Lots of requests for things. Lots of all sorts of things that you have to quickly make a quick decision on what you're going to respond to. But yeah, it can just kill off getting really like big important things that need to be done can get delayed because you're just busy sifting emails. So it's just tricky. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the main things we'll be talking about today are the taxi-brain projects, which is, for what I understand, a new project you're kind of starting now-ish or have started recently. Mm-hmm. And then you wrote a review paper in Nature Neuroscience about spatial navigations in humans and in non-human animals, and kind of how you go from space to abstract maps. Before we do that, I thought we could maybe go slightly back to the conversation I had with Michael, because of course he mentioned you a few times in the conversation, because I guess you and him together, you ran the Sea Hero Quest game, which is this very successful mobile game that I guess lets you investigate spatial navigation and memory. Maybe that's the way to put it. So the kind of question I'd like to start with here is that one thing Michael mentioned a few times is that you really had difficulties kind of getting acceptance about the project and the data that you got, and that a lot of people criticize it as saying, well, this is just a game, this isn't, real science or whatever. It's a bit of a gimmick or whatever. And to some extent, that to me seems like fairly lazy criticism. And I don't know what the specific criticism was, but that kind of idea that it's just a game to me seems like just dismissing it without really thinking about it too much. But it seems to me that, of course, there is a nugget of truth in that. And, you do have drawbacks with this kind of data. Michael described a lot of how much time went into making it fun. Adding things, subtracting things that just you would not do in an experiment. So, there are these drawbacks. I'm just curious kind of what are some genuine criticisms of that, or maybe even a different way of phrasing it. What are kind of your main problems when working with the data?
Yeah, it's a great question about what are the sort of limitations and challenges and problems that you encounter. And that project, as discussed in the previous podcast with Michael, just sprang out of an incredible phone call that came in to Michael, and he phoned me. So it's really unusual. By
the way, did you believe him? Like, what was your reaction when he said, Michael, oh yeah, I got this crazy phone call? And did you go like, oh yeah, that makes sense?
No, I believe Michael. I mean, in my career as well, I got an email once that sounded like some sort of African prince offering me money, and I ignored it. And then a week later, I got a follow-up email to say, I don't know if you received our email, but you now only have 2 weeks left to apply for the $600,000 we'd like you to apply for. Are you at all interested? And it was completely genuine. I then wrote an application and got $600,000 sent to me. So I've been used to this weird way in life you can get funding that's just very odd. So this wasn't a surprise.
So just briefly, to be fair, I'd never really heard of people getting, for me, like from what I've heard, getting grant money is very difficult and basically a lottery. And you seem to now have two examples where almost the opposite seems to be the case.
Yeah.
Why? Like, why do you think you were contacted there, or Michael in the other instance?
They're both odd. I mean, the $600,000 was the James McDonald Foundation, where they had a process of selecting who they wanted to get to apply. So you had to be selected and then written to. And then you had like a 50% chance, I think, of obtaining the funding. So it's a very odd process, and they've changed that, I suspect. And you're right; these aren't normal. Vast majority of grants awarded are through government bodies or large scale charities like the Wellcome Trust, highly regulated and very organised. And I have received those as well, and run an entire career on crazy phone calls. But possibly the weirdest one was once getting contacted by somebody who said, oh, I've applied for a grant. The funding body said they don't like my collaborator, my co-PI. They gave me a list of people that they might think would be suitable, and you were at the top of the list. Would you like to be the co-PI? I said, yes. They wrote back the next day, they go, oh, we've got funded. You're now a co-PI on a grant. And he sent me the grant to look at, but this was an arts grant, so it was a very small budget and not a huge project to worry about. But again, at the sort of ludicrous level of, I've just said yes to a phone call, and now you're a PI on a project. So things can happen like that. So when Michael phoned, it wasn't the most strange thing, but the way it panned out, as Michael's described in your podcast, as things move forward with that, we suddenly realized this is really big. This is very serious, and it can believe the sort of entourage of people involved in the process. Going back, you said your question was, this is of course amazing that we've been able to test 4 million people worldwide and see cognition across the planet and dive into questions with unprecedented, fidelity. It has been incredible doing that. That's the positive sales side, and we've got lots of work to that's coming out that we'll be publishing soon. The downsides are, it's a game. So we're trying to understand how cognition works, how people behave, and we assume that this taps into the real world, how do people actually navigate. And the question sort of, is a video game actually valid? And we've done a fair bit of work to suggest it is in many cases. So if you're bad at Sea Hero Quest, it will predict you being bad in the real world. We've done research to show that. But if someone's really poor at video games, that validity starts to break down. So if you find it hard to control a boat in a virtual game, whereas you can walk fine around a neighborhood, then you do have this obstacle in terms of that game helping predict. And that's true of a lot of different tests, in neuropsychology. If you're using it for clinical things, in many cases, people have to be able to see, like if you're using Raven's matrices as an example, you have to see it. If you're blind, you can't do that task. So the game has these sort of limitations as well, that nothing's ever perfect. But the most frustrating thing probably I would say about a project on that scale was that for sort of ethical, positive reasons of like data security, and the way it ran, we couldn't identify anyone. So you couldn't have any link to someone beyond their phone ID. And it's not a code you could trace back to them. It's scrambled by the company. So that was a good feature. And we were criticized in the Guardian newspaper by collecting data from millions of people, and this is really bad. Okay. But actually, it was the most data secure, anonymous project I've ever worked on. It was really extreme. Downside to that is you can't say much about anybody. You have rely on their input within the video game, and that for us, if you look at a project on a scale where you've tested 4 million people, and you'd just like to know things like what year did they finish their education, or how much exercise they get a day, what's their ambitions in life, there's loads of things you'd be really interested in, but you can't ask them these questions. But in all other research projects, it's quite easy to just put a questionnaire in there.
But so just briefly, you do have information about what age, gender, and that kind of stuff. So you do have some information, right? So as I said, I actually played the game, I think, so my data is probably in there somewhere. But I can't remember, though. Was it just at the beginning you put in your age and gender, that's it? Or...
Yeah, so throughout the game, it kind of, again, these are all part of the careful design where it would get you playing it a bit, and quite soon into the game say, thank you for helping out with dementia research. If can you help us more? The messaging is very careful by you win a badge if you do this now for your boat. And we had 9 demographic questions that were really fought over. And they weren't all the top of the list, because what we realized is we needed questions that would translate into every one of the 17 languages in the game, and that would not be confused by people quickly on a phone. So if you one question we'd love to know,
what's
right?
An example?
So the questions we decided to go for were, what hand do you write with? What, are you left or right-handed? Because you can have a kind of symbol for that on the screen, and it's very clear what you're asking. But as you say, the most key questions we looked at in the first piece of analysis was, are you male or female? How old are you? And which country are you from? And that country question unlocks a lot of information, because if you know which country people are from, you can link then the data back to GDP and a whole host of other features about different countries. So that was the most important question we asked, I think, in the game, was which country are you from? And it was quite successful, because that one was like a passport entry. So you might, for all sorts of online documents, you're used to going and going, I select my country. So it just looked like that. And I think that again, for that reason, worked really well. But so we do have fantastic data, but I just think I wish there had been a way, and we fought as a way to try and get around this as scientists, to see if we could we link this to a questionnaire, and in the timescales, as Michael described, it was extremely like neck break speed. We couldn't get there, and I think that's one of the limitations of the work. And it's something we've been following up. We have now tested, well over 800 people, where we know an enormous amount on these people and Sea Hero Quest.
Like outside of in the lab, basically.
In the lab, online, but via a portal where you can get consent. But as Michael mentioned in the previous podcast you ran, we've now redeveloped Sea Hero Quest, so it's on the App Store again. But now if you want to play it, you need a code that's given to you by a scientist. And so we're hoping to set up lots and lots of projects that are linked to projects. So soon we hope to have a campaign where people can just go get a code and go and help out, and then they can fill out a questionnaire. They could do all sorts of things. You could, sorry.
So like what is why couldn't you say, for, let's say people already played the game for 2 hours or something, what prevents you from just adding a questionnaire there and saying like, an optional questionnaire? Is it just that you think people are going to stop playing the game, or because it seems like that's definitely technically possible? So
yeah, that's right. It wasn't part of the game's design. I think it's more to do with limitations on the actual spots the game. Like, so it might have been something we could do. Again, this goes back to discussions we had back then. You're right. It was a frustrating aspect that there was a kind of, they weren't keen to just add extra questions at the end. We needed to keep this small, and for all these reasons, it ended up being in that format. But as I say, the new version that's on the App Store, See Your Request Research, is there to do that, and anybody could use it. So this could be undergraduates in a department. They could go to their departmental supervisor and say, "I've got access to this. Could you supervise me to run a project?" It doesn't have to be some fancy, impressive team, but of course we do have those, researchers who are in different countries who are keen to follow up. But we really hope it gets used more as a tool. Like, it's a 10-minute test you can add, so you can spend, as you said, like 2 hours playing it, or you can do 10 minutes. 10 minutes is sufficient to give us really good data, really, with that test.
And you said you need now when you download it, you need a code from an experimenter. Is that then something the experimenters create themselves, or do they have to go through you?
They go through a platform, a website. So they go through they fill out what they want to do, it gets approved, and then they get sent a whole lot of codes that they then distribute to people. And when those codes have been used, they get an email from, this is Alzheimer's Research UK, the charity that have very kindly supported this. They've organised the website, and so the data would come back to the researcher anonymously, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so can you say something? With Michael, I think we mainly talked about the development of the game and kind of the initial papers that have come out that validated the quality of the data set. Is there anything you can say about kind of the so to speak, unquote, quote unquote, actual science kind of that's coming out soon, like the exciting stuff that Michael alluded to? Or
yeah, I can. I can't tell you about some of the results. So some of it is, some of it's still at a situation where
or maybe questions you.
But what I can point out, so what I can point out are things that are, I can put the 2 and 2 together. That's in the public domain, in the sense of what's sitting there. Anyone who's looked at it could figure out. Right. So. This is a case of requiring salami slicing. If we just took the entire data and ran all the, you would end up with a paper that has got 92 figures in it or something. And so we've really tried to figure out. So we have papers we're writing up. So this has not been put out before, but this is where we are. So the first time we're ever really talking about this. But we have our paper that's been under review and accepted on the impact of cities on people's navigation skill. That's been discussed before, and I don't know if Michael mentioned it in the podcast, but in that case we're able to show that across a set of countries, 38 countries with really gritty cities, if people grew up in cities in those countries, they were worse at navigating in the game. And specifically, the more complicated and curvy the game levels in See Your Request, the worse those participants got. So there was a kind of sense of your experiences growing up in an environment shape how you then navigate, which I think is a really fundamentally interesting point. The reason we were so excited about it is that nobody really looked at it like this before. This is a core question: how does my development affect my cognition later on? And this, for us, is a really clear result that because you've got, 500,000 people's data to look over, then you can see these things. And in our paper, one of the exciting things we've done, for me at least, in terms of good science, is to go and then replicate this effect. So we've tested, all these 4 million people, downsampled it to really clean participants. So you've got 500,000. And then you can then go and test 800 people, tiny fraction, a new set, and find exactly the same effect size in this.
Okay.
new data. So we've extended that in all sorts of different ways, and that should be coming out soon. So readers, that will be embargoed by the journal. But that's going to be, extend the story when the paper comes out much more substantially than I can describe here. But that's just one of the 9 questions. The other bits we've been looking at, we have a paper we're about to submit on sleep. So how does the hours of sleep you get relate to performance in a game? But more importantly, for us, just generally, how is sleep distributed worldwide? If you had to guess which countries sleep the most and which sleep the least, would you be able to predict that right? And is there cultural clustering? Do certain countries sleep similar lengths? So, and that's an interesting question where you have far-flung countries where they're kind of, Western offshoots like Australia and New Zealand. They're very far geographically away from the UK, but maybe they've got similar sleep. Right. It'd be interesting to look at. But we see all sorts of really fascinating patterns in sleep that aren't even related to our video game. It's a huge sample of just under 1 million people where we've got really clean data we can extract and discuss lifespan effects of how sleep changes over the lifespan.
That's an additional question you asked, or like how much do you usually sleep? Or
how many hours of sleep do you get on average? Yeah. Okay. So, and again, we've done some more follow-up to, there's a lot of more precise sleep-based questions you want to know about people. And of course, we don't know if this is the actual time. Someone says they sleep 7 hours, maybe they only sleep 6. We don't know. But there are other studies showing very strong correlations between self-reported sleep and actual sleep on a population level. This isn't with, this is hundreds of thousands. But that's just 2 examples. The other examples we've been looking at is how good do you think you are at navigating compared to how you actually are? And then the interesting question with that, of course, is again, world population. Which countries are on the money? Like which populations of groups they get it right, at a world average, they think they're not very good and they aren't. Well, they think they're very, very good and they are, where there are other countries that think they're really good, but not so good. And the neat thing there is we've been able to predict using other worldwide metrics, when they interviewed large scale populations about properties of what might, relate to this. We have been able to predict which countries overestimate their skill. And so that's something we're looking to submit very soon. And then handedness, there's a long story, but our left and right hander is different. And here we've got, 700,000, people with different handedness scores. And normally it's quite hard to find left-handers, but here we've got a lot. So we've been asking the old classic question of, does it affect navigation skill? And again, I won't tell the answer because that's what the reading the article is. But those are just a few, but there are other papers as well, linked to some of these questions, and more mathematical analysis. Everything we're publishing now is just, what's the distance people traveled in the game? Like, so someone who's very good will travel a short distance, but someone who travels a long distance is bad. But what if we look at how wiggly you are? Does that tell us something about your cognition? And so we've been teasing apart these sort of patterns in the data.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're getting also a lot of data, it seems, on questions that don't seem like immediately related to what you actually set out to do, like the sleep questions and that kind of stuff. I mean, is that something you thought about before, or was this just a surprise because you had suddenly such a large sample that you went, oh, wait, we can actually do kind of basic descriptions of some of the other things that aren't really out there so far?
Yeah, we knew that as well. Now we set out, the motivation for the questions was along the lines of what if we were to develop a tool for monitoring dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, or potentially diagnostic tool, then what would you want to know? So age and gender are really key. Our data shows very clearly you need to know if someone's navigating what their skill is. It's really quite useful to know age and gender. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, what are the other questions that would be helpful in filtering with more precision the diagnostic or the monitoring tool? And so those were all picked along those lines where sleep is a known factor for potentially memory and dementia. But as soon as we got these questions in, it was very clear they were going to give us some quite important results. And Michael described how we thought we might get 100,000 people after a year. Within 2 days, we'd had it. So I think it was quite clear at that point that we could start to ask questions. As a scientist, in terms of your podcast and kind of thinking about scientific process and people's careers, and you raise a good point in a sense that with a project like that, you start to spiral into areas you don't know enough about. So we're looking at education and sleep, and so there it's been absolutely fantastic to collaborate with experts to get their input to research articles, where they can give us their expert opinion and help draft a manuscript and process that I wouldn't normally do. I'd normally be in my silo working away, and I don't need someone else really. But I've loved that. It's been a really fantastic part of science.
That must be a similar experience that those collaborators get, right? When they get an email from you saying, hey, we've got data on 1 million people's sleep. Do you want to collaborate with us? Okay, sure.
Exactly. Funnily enough, most of them say yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add to Sierra Quest? Otherwise, I'd move on because we've talked about it for quite a while now.
No, that's covered most of the issues, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know how much you can say about the Taxi Brain projects, because I guess it's a pretty current or even future project, even more than Sierra Quest to some extent. But I wanted to talk a bit about it, at least briefly. I watched parts of, what was it? UCL Minds Lunch Hour Lecture, that's on YouTube, from 2013 that you gave. So I thought, related to that, I'd ask something you explained there, which is, what was the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, and how does that relate to the kind of science that you and other people are doing today?
That's a great question. That's a nice sort of curveball one, because I'm not an expert on that historical event. What I know, and people could just look up on Wikipedia and I'll probably find rapidly I'm wrong, but my understanding was that the United Kingdom decided in London they would have a great exhibition, like a large salon, of the greatest advances in the age of arts and sciences, and show off all these amazing things that have been created in the UK and get the world to visit London and see all this and show off, and obviously to increase wealth. That was as ever these things. It's an economic capitalist approach to that. And what's amazing is if you look at the historical pictures, there's, they built in a huge glass house in Hyde Park. It's huge, an entire building to hold this, and then took it all down again. And so the reason that's important for the story of cognitive science, and indeed the hippocampus as a brain area, is that in 1853 or 54, when this occurred, people came to see it, of course, from all around the world. But anyone could just at that point be a taxi driver, just turn up, get a license and drive people across London and charge them whatever they wanted, as far as I know. It may well have been regulated to some extent. You couldn't just be a taxi driver, but there was no test. And so there was huge embarrassment worldwide when people were lost all over London. Like rich people coming to see it ended up in the wrong bits of London. So there was a stamp down to say, we can't have this. We've got to institute some test for London. And so they developed what's known as the knowledge of London, the knowledge it's just referred to, where if you wanted to be a taxi driver from that point forward, you needed to prove you knew enough about the streets of London, how to get around. That, and this is what mid-1840, so in 2000, so a millennium later, Eleanor Maguire, Irish neuroscientist at University College London, decided to have a look at the structural size of a group of these London taxi drivers' brains and compare them to non-taxi drivers to see if there were any differences. And the reason Eleanor was interested in that is that there have been a number of reports in different animal species suggesting that there was clear variation in the size of this bit of the brain, the hippocampus, with spatial ability. So like even sort of seasonal changes when there's spatial demand on retrieving or storing nuts versus other periods. So it's like across many different species. Do humans show something like this was the question. And indeed, she showed there was a difference, that their posterior hippocampus in London licensed taxi drivers is larger than non-taxi drivers. And in fact, their anterior hippocampus shrinks. So it's not they have a bigger hippocampus. That was what the Sun newspaper ran a cartoon with this picture of a giant brain on when it was discovered. Actually, it's sort of like a redistribution along the axis from being increased at the posterior part and shrunken in the anterior. And it's quite a big discovery because it's in a lot of textbooks and it's had a lot of impact on people's thinking about brain. It's sort of an extra pillar under what is all the evidence that the hippocampus has anything to do with memory and space. This is one of the pillars that's sort of held up to say, not only X, Y, Z, but also look at London taxi drivers.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
so
I
you
did
asked,
my bachelor's I started in 2010, and then there was, I think, in like first year, memory and cognition lecture, you learn about HM, and at some point then later you learn about Eleanor Maguire's taxi study. Maybe this
exactly.
was because we were in London also, so it's
Yeah,
slightly biased, but yeah.
That's right. So HM, of course, this famous amnesic who had a lot more than this hippocampus removed surgically, but the key area was the hippocampus. It was completely lost, and it is one of the key pillars held up. So going back to your question,
briefly, I'm just
sure.
I'm just curious, like how were you? Because I mean, you've been for most of your life, most of your career at UCL, but that was still before your time at UCL, right? This kind of the initial study.
Yes, I had just started my PhD with Neil Burgess at the time, so I remember exactly where and when Eleanor Maguire told me that she discovered this fact in a stairwell inside the Institute of Neurology. I remember her turning to me and saying, "Oh, you know what I've discovered," and it's just mind blowing. So yeah, I wasn't a fully fledged doctor by that point, but it was quite a discovery. Yeah, so going back to your question about the Taxi Brains project we've set up is really following on, 2022, but the time has passed. But back around after Eleanor Maguire discovered that, her research team, and I was part of it, did a lot of work studying these taxi drivers. They're absolutely fascinating group of individuals to study. So just a bit of background for them as well. It's worth going back to the Great Exhibition in London. They started this, but today, right while we're podcasting now, while I'm interviewing with you, there's bound to be hundreds of people on mopeds driving around London with maps in front of them, trying to memorize the names and layout of all these streets to become licensed taxi drivers. So there's a distinction in London between licensed taxi drivers and minicab or Uber drivers. And the distinction there is obviously past this test, we'll talk about in a moment, but they're the only ones who are allowed to actually pick up someone who's held their hand in the air. It's illegal to pick up somebody otherwise unless you've got this license. Yeah, for safety reasons, it's all regulated and monitored.
And I'm assuming you're only allowed to use a black cab if you have that. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. So I think they're an incredible group of individuals who do this, and I always enjoy. They're absolutely fantastic to talk to because for me, the reason is that they're one of these rare groups of people who are really using their long-term memory to do something that most people don't. Most people use GPS to find their way around. Like if it's somewhere you've not been in a while, you rely on GPS, or you've never quite made a journey, you'd use GPS for most people. But they're literally every day solving a massive jigsaw puzzle in their head every time somebody asks them for somewhere. So it takes 2 to 4 years to memorize the 26,000 streets. I mean, there's 53,000, somebody told me, in the whole Greater London area that you could memorize. But for the main passing that test, you've really got a very good grasp of 26,000 street names. And
how many zones is that on the tube system? Like, assuming it's not all of it, right?
Depends what badge. There are 2 different badges, and the green badge is the really extended one. Most are green badge holders. And they need to know all these zones. It's huge. It's insane. So they learn in a very.
For people who haven't been to London, I mean, that's such a big area.
Yeah, it's ridiculously big. It's a ludicrous proposition that you would say. Now go and memorize 26,000 thing. And for me as a cognitive neuroscientist, this is fantastic because you've got a task that you could never do in the lab. The cost to train someone to memorize that information, and to know then that everyone you're testing has done what was required. And then crucially, as part of this, going back to the Great Exhibition, they have to sit an exam and prove they did actually know it. So the exam is just being given 2 random places in London, and they have to tell the examiner the exact route each street they would take to go from the origin to the destination, indicating what turn they would take. Is it forward? Is it left, right? Or comply with what roundabout regulation? Everything. They need to know it. They can't just. They also sometimes are not given street names. They're just given hotels. So they need to know thousands of hotels and venues and all these different locations they could be asked to go to. So it gets extremely elaborate. And there's something fascinating talking to them about. We published a paper just at the beginning of this year in Hippocampus on how do they do this. So that was that was the first real step in
So the
our
learning
taxi
or
brains.
once
The
they've
learning.
learned it, the navigating?
The learning process of how they learn.
Okay.
We did a lot of basically a field study looking at this. So that kind of takes me into the taxi brains story. But I guess before I go further into what we're doing, in that paper we just published in Hippocampus, if you go to my Google Scholar page, it's like one of the recent papers sitting in there. It's open access, so anyone can read it as well. That also reviews what do we know up to 2022 about London taxi drivers. So if someone wants to read further on this, I've tried to cover everything that's in the field, every published paper on them. And then we dive into how do they do that? How do you memorize 26,000 streets and thousands of points of interest? And there's a lot of detail in that paper about all the techniques and things they do.
Like explicit techniques that
exactly,
they're aware of.
Exactly. It'd been written out, but this is the first kind of documented article that lays out how do they do this, because I thought it'd be very useful to document that in terms of how might we help develop better test tools for training people. If you want to learn a new city or something, what would you do? Could you do it like a London taxi driver? What do they do?
So, brief question: do these London taxi drivers, are most of them native Londoners who kind of grew up in the city already, or are there actually people who came from outside and then started at zero knowledge? Because that obviously, that would be the most interesting. For the learning part, I think the most interesting comparison might even be people who already have all this knowledge versus people who don't know that much yet about it.
You're right. No, it's a good question. We do, in our follow-up work, we've been asking about this sort of thing. What's their background? And my 90% of them will have, more than that, will have been in London doing something. They got excited about London. Most of them really are like, they love London. They just love being in London and going around London. So it's the idea of being a taxi driver is really appealing, because it's like I get to be paid to drive around and look at London and really get to know under the lid, like lift the lid, and they have to learn all about these venues, and they just love it. They love driving, of course, is the other key aspect of it.
Should hope so.
But you're right. It'd be fascinating to study someone who had no knowledge and then did all this. One of the nicest stories, my PhD student at the time said, one of the taxi drivers to marry his wife. He had to sit there, do the knowledge. His father-in-law said, "You can't marry my daughter."
Was he a taxi driver, or did he was do something else?
Driver.
Okay, so he wasn't just a random person. Okay.
No, he said, "I want you to do this, or if you're good enough, then you can do that." And he did. He succeeded. married his wife. So it was very sweet. It's like throwing down the gauntlet to do that. So that's the background. And then the project Taxi Brains was really a project begun because I decided enough time had passed that there was a number of questions that had not been answered. And I really enjoyed working with Eleanor Maguire when I was in her lab with the participants, the taxi drivers, and thought, well, I'm going to go dive back in again. And I was fortunate to have a really motivated PhD student, Eva Maria Grisbauer, who joined my lab under a EPS, or one of these the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council funding. And she was also co-funded by Ordnance Survey. So they were keen to support work on taxi drivers and mapping and understand that. So this is the government regulated run company that does all the mapping for the UK. So they keep updated maps for the entire layout of roads and highways and all of this. But of course they make money by selling maps. OS maps are very profitable. So they've been fantastic to work with Ordnance Survey. So they began the process of helping fund us and get going. And Eva dived into, Eva Maria she went native with the taxi drivers, attending all these knowledge schools where they learn, studying how they do this. So that was one of the things she did. Another thing she did that we published was looking at boundaries. Where do they think boundaries are in London? Because to me, it seems obvious that this is like the River Thames, and there's places like Soho and Mayfair and, Bloomsbury. Clearly there's Bloomsbury and there's the city, and, I know these labels for London, and I kind of assume taxi drivers would have a really good idea of where they start and end and stop. And what we found was that's not true. They really don't. They have very different perspectives on where they individually think a lot of these boundaries fall. A good number of them are absolutely consistent, but it's small. So things like Soho and Mayfair, there's no dispute. They're distinctly an area. So and the reason we were interested is kind of that hierarchy of navigating. So if you're driving to Soho, if you get a street there, you don't think about what you do inside Soho. You just go to Soho, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Same with Mayfair. But if you're going to somewhere in, say, Bloomsbury, they might not do the same thing because it's more of an open area. It's not got a confined, boundary set to it. And each taxi driver might have their own distinct street they think of as being Bloomsbury. And particularly the City of London is a complete mess. Its boundaries are very irregular, and they don't have an idea, most of them, of where it precisely for them. Well, it's not so much that they do know, or many of them will have to know that, but they don't think about it consciously. Yeah. But that's a very niche question, and it was necessary for the next thing we looked at, which was, let's exploit that exam. Let's go and test them on, can they tell us what streets they would take going from A to B once they're qualified? And what could this tell us? So the really cool thing I felt about this approach was that you can't normally, in a normal population, I can't say to you, all right, Ben, tell me every street you would take in the exact right order from your house to somewhere on the other side of town that's a bar. And you just wouldn't normally know them all to tell me.
Yeah.
But with this, I can test someone 30 streets. I can have someone go through and plan it all and see what route they're taking. And for me, an exciting thing around that was going back to previous collaborations we'd had of this is exciting to look at the cognition of that in relation to networks, because they're plotting their path through a network of connected nodes and edges in a graph. And can we predict then when they take a long time to think about the next step or a short time in the real world? So taxi drivers aren't robots. They're not an amazing DeepMind AI. They are human and limited. But in some ways, like memorizing 26,000 streets and efficiently in 3 seconds telling you it. And I think a key thing is they can do all that. They can give you the answer to this question. And they really have to solve it fast, because they could be sitting in the middle of Euston Road, a highway, with cars zooming around them. And someone says, can you get me to Peter Street in Soho? They can't sit and have a good old think about it while a line of buses behind them are honking at them. So they have to solve that fast. And they can do that on the basis of having eaten a sandwich and a cup of tea, not on huge amount of training, all sorts of. I think this is one of the things we underestimate, is that the human brain is running on the basic food and drink we're eating. It's remarkable with the energy resources it's got. So they're doing that, but that's been really exciting to think, can we predict where they'll go and when they'll make the jumps in the space? So looking at mental simulation in the real world with a group of people that have a vast state space, that the factorial number of possible jumps is bigger than the life of the universe, or the number of stars in the universe is far smaller than the number of transitions those taxi drivers could make in London in their head. So anyway, that's one of the projects, but we then put them in the MRI scanner as part of Taxi Brains. And of course, in 2022, we want to know, can we still see these differences in their hippocampal size? And I don't have the answer yet. We're sitting on the data. We have to crunch it. Yeah. My next meeting after this, in fact, after this podcast, we just to follow up and see where we are.
Okay. So is one thing I was curious about is that, as you mentioned, there's been quite a lot of work on taxi drivers. And I was just curious, is there anything here that you basically couldn't have done in 2005 or whatever? Is it, or is it a matter of just you or a student got really interested in it and you just said, oh, well, we still have outstanding questions that we want to ask? Or is there really anything where you went like, oh, finally now we can do this or that?
There are two things we can do now. I mean, most of it is just we didn't do this in the past. And I think for me, that capacity to exploit their recall is incredible. I absolutely love watching their recall of these routes, because many times there's no gap. They'll just reel out a sequence of places, 5 streets in a row that they can think through, where the gap is less than 500 milliseconds in their response time. Other points, 20 seconds, they're sitting thinking, what move do I make next? Why is it taking 20 seconds to choose the next street? That's rare. Most of it is around 3 seconds. So that's something we could have done. We could have done it in 1853, right? What's new? The two things new we've got with this project. One is the fact with the MRI data, we can go much deeper. So we've got much more resolution in MRI scans, and we can now decompose the hippocampus into all the subregions. So it's the posterior hippocampus is what's been measured in the past, but is it CA3? Is it CA1? There are a number of subregions to the hippocampus that may be where there are or differences in size. And to discover that will be quite important, I think, to clarify. I mean, let's say even just if we can replicate the effect, it will be important because it's a textbook story.
Yeah.
But if we can't replicate it, it doesn't mean it was definitely wrong in the past. It may be that things have changed with a number of aspects of what's going on. I wouldn't rule out that it's. But my prediction, given the number of studies on this, is that we will replicate that prior finding. So we can do more precision. The final thing we can do new is that it turns out See Here Request is quite helpful here because we can look and see how these taxi drivers compare to the rest of us, the 4 million other people. And they should be fantastic at navigating. But what is it they do? Is there something in particular they do that can tell us? And if you put those two things together, there's an interesting story here that starts to build the story with taxi brains, is that for taxi drivers, they're good at navigating, they should be exceptional in See Here Request, and their hippocampal size is larger than you and I. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are at the early stages of Alzheimer's dementia, who have a smaller hippocampus and are worse at navigating. And how does this manifest? So we've been looking at Alzheimer's cases with Michael Hornberger and understanding the impact of brain damage and dementia on navigation. With taxi drivers, it's the reverse. It's thinking, if you become very good at navigating, what does it show? What patterns emerge in the data there? And that's the reason this is possible, is that See Here Request benchmarks navigation in a way we never had before. So if you have a 54-year-old man from the UK and you want to test, we have hundreds of thousands of 54-year-old men from the UK to compare them to. So there's loads of analysis that can be done with that. But that's partly what's motivated this. So the Taxi Brains is then this sort of wonderful collaboration between Ordnance Survey, who supported the initiation of the project and continue to be involved, and Alzheimer's Research UK, who supported the development of See Here Request, who are now, interested in us thinking about driving and mobility and these taxi drivers as, what can they what could they unlock about the human brain that we don't know? But for sure, we'll be doing more. We've also run a functional study looking at how they do that planning. So when you give them an origin and destination, do we see grid-like patterns in their brains as they plan? How do they activate? To what extent do they use their prefrontal cortex? That is when you say, right, I'm going to plan over a state space of 26,000 states, that should involve a lot of prefrontal cortex. And a key question for us is they can't be doing that on a model-based process. So, they can't be, it's impossible. So what are they doing? And what is and already preliminary, we can see some really nice results about why, where their prefrontal cortex gets dampened, where they can do some very clever stuff. It just doesn't need to use it. So that's been a really key question for me as well, is getting at planning in the brain, looking at these. So it's a diverse set of questions, and we're building it. It really isn't just one study. It really is now a sort of increasing project where we're interested in all aspects of London taxi driver cognition, really, and what it can tell us about the brain, and then help with dementia, really. So that's a bit of a long answer, but
it was there was one thing that half surprised me, half seemed obviously true, and that's when you mentioned that the taxi drivers, you would expect them to be better at the See Here Request game. And initially I thought, yeah, probably. I mean, that's basically their job. But then on the other hand, they've learned, they've spent lots of time practicing London specifically, and I'm assuming they've used physical maps that they've looked at to learn, or drove around, or walked around, or whatever. Well, walking would take a bit, probably driving around London. Whereas in See Here Request, if I remember correctly, you do see a map at the beginning sometimes, right? I can't remember. It's been a while, but often at least you're in an unfamiliar environment, right? Or right. I guess my question is kind of maybe more an interaction between that they might be good at doing the navigation, but only once they've learned the environment. Whereas in the beginning, where they're maybe not as familiar with the environment, it might not make that much of a difference.
Yeah, they might, if they're not good, they might improve more rapidly than everyone else. That's one possibility. That is something we can look at with the game. And you're right. So Eleanor Maguire had run a study previously. I was keen to go back to this because previously she sort of tested them and compared them to a very small sample, maybe another 20 participants or so, on their ability to watch a number of movies going in around route and understand and work out what sequence people had seen landmarks in. And they were better at that. But I said that's not telling us a huge amount, where here we can look at the trajectories. Why do they make this choice or that choice? Because CHEROQuest affords us the capacity to analytically look at when the trajectory takes a certain shape to it in a path. What is it people are choosing to do? Are they heading for open water, occluded edges? As you played the game yourself, it was designed with the games designers and an architect, Ruth Dalton, who spent her career designing virtual environments to test and probe kind of these sorts of questions. So there are some levels where it's a very clear map and it's quite an easy map. There are levels where you put the clear map and it's really complicated, 5 places to get to, and it needs to be planned carefully. And then there are levels where the map's just all water damaged and you can't see anything. So taxi drivers might be very poor when there's no map. Maybe they really are good. Their excellence comes out in their strategies for map use. You're right. So that is another exciting dimension. It's not quite as simple as saying, well, of course they'll be better. It's more nuanced than that. And indeed, another aspect of this is they've got a smaller anterior hippocampus than the rest of us, according to the data. And so that's thought to be part of a system for doing new encoding of memories. So they should be worse at navigating if they got a smaller hippocampus. So they do present this interesting conundrum to me that I'm hoping we'll find out some really nice results from. But that's part of it. These are the things we couldn't do, 5 years ago or so, maybe a bit.
Yeah. By the way, how many London officially people with the badge cabbies are there?
Oh, I keep forgetting. I did see it on the website.
Tens of thousands?
Many thousands. Many thousands. I forget. And it fluctuates, of course, but it's a lot. And if you walk around London in certain areas, you'll see it's flooded with taxis. One thing I was just wondering about is like how many, what to get like decent sample sizes across several experiments, what percentage of London taxi drivers have to take part in the study? But it's not a high percentage then. No, that's a beauty of this is we've currently got a cohort of 80 participants, and in the past that was just so hard to get. But because of Twitter and a lot of media, we've been able to recruit many more people than we would have. Our power calculations suggest we need 34 brains, like 34 MRI scans. Is like double the previous sample size to find the effect. It's very clear. Can we replicate it? So we don't need 100 taxi brains to test these predictions. But the more we can work with, the better. And there's a whole range of questions we're coming up with. Some may require a lot of taxi drivers. Some may be not so many. It just depends. But yeah, again, social media is a good example where that's made these projects possible. It really is really helped enormously. It's Twitter.
Yeah, one thing I just realized was we were talking about this is that, as you said, you have two separate, let's say, extremes here, with people who have dementia who are very bad at this and the cab drivers who are very good at this. And I think often it's very interesting to study people who are world-class at something, who are really good at a specific task. But that's very difficult to do because often, number one, there aren't many people of those in a specific area. And number two, most world-class people earn enough money or a lot of money so they wouldn't take part in a study. But it seems to me that you've really found not necessarily you specifically found it, but like this kind of research area has found an elite level of function in something where there are lots of people around, at least in London, who could actually take part and might even want to.
Yeah, that's true. And the ones who come forward are they're so much more enthusiastic to do the science than the average undergraduate who wants to do a psych study. They're really motivated. I say that if your job you've chosen is to try and every sort of maybe 15 to 30 minutes, plan a route across an entire city, and you're an unusual person who's got that mental challenge in mind. It's really impressive. I think you're right. It's telling us something about human expertise as well. They're an interesting model for how do you compress a massive amount of knowledge. And that's one of the things with the taxi brains that was so interesting, really, for me.
Yeah. I remember once someone I can't remember who did a study about, I think, football players. and something like spatial decision making or something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like if you have a football player, especially let's say someone like a midfielder, let's say someone like Iniesta or whatever, right? Like they have this incredible ability to know where people are and how they're moving through space and how they can, get to different places. But the problem with football players is, number one, there aren't that many elite players. And number two, they earn millions, so they're not going to take part in your study. Whereas, the cab drivers, for you, fortunately, don't earn millions. They might see it differently, but luckily from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's if we paid them at the same rate they're driving a taxi around, an hour's worth of experiment would get quite expensive. But luckily, they've been fantastic at helping out with.
Okay, so one topic I'd like to talk about, which is kind of, it's kind of related to all of the stuff you do, but it's not directly related to the stuff we've been talking about, is that from what I can tell, you are one of relatively few people who do studies both with humans and with non-human animals. I'm sure there are other people, but it seems to me most people either do work with rodents. I mean, usually you focus on one species usually, and you've done work with rodents and you've done work with humans. So I'd just like to talk about that for a few minutes at least, kind of what that's like and what the advantages, disadvantages might be. I thought we could maybe start by saying, how did you start out? Like, did you learn fMRI first, or did you learn rodent work first, or kind of what was your trajectory in working with these different species?
That's a great question. I started out with neuropsychology. So my undergraduate degree at UCL was in neuroscience, but I got involved in a study at King's College London looking at the Institute of Psychiatry at temporal lobectomy patients. Testing their navigation, their path integration ability.
Oh, really?
Then.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my introduction. I loved the project. I love all sorts of it. It involved immersive virtual reality. In 1997, we were doing that. And then they were really expensive and unwieldy and virtual reality headsets, so it never worked out. So I started work with humans doing that, and then I went to a PhD in neuropsychology with Neil Burgess, who got really into to starting a line of work on that back in, this is 1998. And throughout my PhD, I was excited to get into brain imaging. It was really on the rise, particularly functional magnetic resonance imaging. It really exploded.
Especially at UCL.
At UCL. So the brain of the Phil was just discovering all sorts of major discoveries in the late 90s. And slowly sort of worked up to the point where I was getting involved in MRI studies. And, I carried on doing neuropsychology for a fair bit, but eventually joined Eleanor McGuire's lab back in, having gone to Cambridge and then coming back, and did that for 3.5 years in her lab. We talked about the taxi driver work, but a lot of that was MRI. So crucially, what happened at the end of that period in my career trajectory, the grid cells had been discovered in 2005, and there was this explosive. These for people who aren't aware of these cells mostly in the medial entorhinal cortex of rodents have been recorded from predominantly, that provide this hexagonal tessellating pattern of activity across a space. Although the rat's running at random all around searching for rewards, the signal is absolutely stunning. I think they're one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience. Basically, grid cells are just jaw-dropping. And I thought, wow, I really made a mistake, didn't I? I should have been in this field. And back in
you were
period,
kind of in the field, right? I mean, you were in
but it
spatial
was
navigation.
frustrating. So you're right. So I was in this field of spatial navigation. I was enjoying it, but I realized if you're in that field, the precision and the level and the questions you can ask with rodents that are just I have to say credit to particularly say Christian Doler and Neil Burgess and Caswell Barry when they started thinking about ways to look at some of these things in MRI data that sparked a whole lot of ways of looking at human data. We've moved on, but still there is that sense of you're at the coalface, with the cells and the neurons. And I realized, so if I remember right, it was like a Thursday, I noticed you could apply for a grant in the Wellcome Trust that would give you 3 years of personal funding, a fellowship, with just your salary and research costs, with no teaching. But you could get it only if you completely changed what you were doing to something else. So it was an advanced training fellowship. And I thought, it'd be great to to do that. That would be amazing. I can apply to do this. And that's what I did. But the problem was that the deadline was Monday.
Yeah.
So I had to develop an entire grant over a weekend, get it costed and everything, organize a supervisor, the entire thing in 3 days for a grant deadline. Absolute hell. But it transpired. I worked through and got awarded that. So that was a real complete about shift. Paper wise and reading didn't change. I'd always been reading these things. I just went from pressing buttons in MATLAB and putting people in MRI scanners to, oh my goodness, the amount of training you need to do rodent physiology was huge. And I always think I for sure did it the wrong way. You would want to do the rodent physiology when you're a young student because you have a bit more time and you can do that. I had a small child at home by that point, and that is not a good combination of single unit physiology and small children. So
just briefly, were you at the time, what was your position? Were you elected to give lectures? Were you a lecturer, or did that pay for you to not have to do anything else?
Not have to do anything else. Yeah.
Okay, so you could actually focus on. It wasn't like you had to give lectures every other day or something.
Yep.
Okay.
But I'm really grateful the Wellcome Trust to set that up. They disbanded that fellowship a few years later.
Really?
They weren't. As a charity, constantly rethinking about where the most useful use of the funding was, and they decided that wasn't producing the ideal results. And I think, one perspective would have on that was that I suspect, like me, many of the other people who've gone through this advanced training 3-year fellowship was capped at 3 years, is how the hell are you going to then apply for the next bit? Because you've got I couldn't generate, successful papers. Right. 3 years of learning electrophysiology, it wasn't going to happen. So I didn't. I literally was at a disadvantage to extend my career at that point. And there wasn't any kind of leeway. They were very sympathetic, but there wasn't that kind of leeway to say, we can take a gamble on you with no evidence. That just doesn't work like that.
But didn't it help to have that on your CV? Didn't it help to have that fellowship on your CV? You said you were at a disadvantage, but to some extent you also had more of a track record.
Certainly. Once you got a personal fellowship, so this was 2007, I was able to negotiate a proleptic appointment in the university, which has become much more difficult now. But back then that was an accepted kind of, that you've required significant grant funding for your salary. You've clearly got a track record that suggests you'll go forward and do that. So the university say, when your fellowship ends, we will appoint you as a lecturer. And that's indeed what happened to me. Yeah, that was an impressive. I'm very grateful to Kate Jeffrey, who took me into her lab to train. The problem I had as well was that the lab closed immediately, and they had, building works and all sorts of things going on at the beginning of my. But that's true. Almost everyone's had these sorts of challenges in their career where you have to readjust and do things. That is the challenge of being successful in science, I think, actually, is adapting to no end of problems that get sent your way, things not working. So your question was more than just how did you end up doing it? It was like, how does it work out? How do you do that? What do you do?
First I was just curious about how, because it seems to me that there are some people who switched or who do both, and it seems to me most of them start off with the physiology and then switch to humans. So I guess that's what you also said might be the better route.
It is, But I have seen other people. Helen Barron is another example where she was in human fMRI with Tim Behrens and switched to working with a team in Oxford with single unit recording. So I'm not the only one. I was very impressed when she came forward to say I was going to do this. Did it work? But it's hard. It really isn't. It's not a trivial thing to do. And indeed then running, like you said, the question of how do you run a lab that does multi-species work?
Maybe one question here I had is, are you doing it fully in parallel, or does it kind of come and go that, you have a student who has funding to do animal work, so you're doing more animal work the next 3 years or whatever, or are you really, how does that balance kind of?
It's very dependent upon what successful grants you're getting. So in the last few years, I was fortunate to have a human brain project grant funded for a 2-year postdoc to do recordings. So we published a key paper from that last year on how do rats navigate a multi-compartment environment with different doors opening and closing. And so that was part of a key project with the postdoc. And that's been great, but that's very much like that. It was supposed to link up with other aspects, very difficult across the grant on that sort of time scale. But what's been really fun in the last 3 years has been another EU grant where we were allowed to put together two students together, two very talented students. I ended up hiring Chris Ganstrom and Niels Nyberg, who both Swedish, as it turned out. It wasn't by selecting for Swedish brilliance, but they are brilliant. So these two particularly talented students joined my lab Niels ended up working on the rodents and Chris looking at humans in the exact same paradigm. So we wanted to have humans and rats running around trying to find hidden goals and going to random locations to get rewards, and look at the neural activity in rats alongside the neural activity as recorded with fMRI in humans, and then relate those, to integrate them too with reinforcement learning models that would predict what the patterns in the two species were. And that's still underway. We've got as you can imagine, the fMRI data is somewhat easier to acquire. The rodent data is ongoing. But it's been amazing. It's been a real joy to have got to that point in my career where I could see, this actual integration in the lab of the human and rodent work in one paradigm. Yeah. And we'd been building that up for 5 years before with a whole team of people looking at rats and humans. And one of my intentions going forward is not just to stick to two species, but it would be great fun to work with more species where we can exploit other phenomena and look at that. But all these things take time.
Specific species in mind?
Bees are an interesting species to study now. But there are others like Drosophila I haven't worked with yet, but there's a lot of exciting questions you can look at with other species where they have different ways of planning. So humans and rats differ, right? And the rats' vision's different. They use their whiskers a lot. They have to groom. They have to pause to groom a lot. And humans, blink and all sorts of things get bored in ways that rats do. So there's interesting questions about sampling across lots of species and trying to understand core common mechanisms and things that make them different. But these things are all a challenge. And I think one of the things I have encountered that I hadn't anticipated, but is blimmin' obvious when you think about it, is that if you are running a lab with all these species and different questions and you're integrating over it, I've got all that experience to draw and I've done all those things and I know how beneficial it is. But if you arrive as a brand new student engaging in this, you've got to learn your trade. You can't afford to do all that. So you've got to pick one, and then you end up being a bit more siloed as a student. And I think that then makes some challenges running a lab where people they need really detailed feedback and other people just have no idea what you're talking about in that part of the lab. But
I'd figure at UCL you have enough people who can help out from other labs, but it has to be collaborative.
It has to be, and I really highlight the fact the only reason I've been successful at making this work is that I'm surrounded by just wonderful colleagues who've completely put up with me not being able to pull the same weights. They've been just wonderful. So these are particularly people like Kate Jeffrey, who's run the Institute of Behavioral Neuroscience, where I've been able to work as an absolute, star in terms of making that work. But it's not just her; it's all the other PIs that I work alongside have really made it. I just couldn't do what I'm doing at all in most places, and just collaborators who help work on more detailed analysis. And this is the great thing in science about the further you go through the process, you get to collaborate with lots of people and throw ideas around and make jumps and leaps that you see as the PI that you don't really get earlier in your career. I think people just get this continuous negative narrative about how horrible science is a lot of the time. But that side of it's really good.
Yeah, just as an aside, Kate Jeffrey has also been on the podcast. So if people want to know more about her and her work, there's an episode about that I can put in the description. But one thing I'm just curious here is, so this is something that I'm kind of interested in animal work. I'm not sure I ever do it, but I think the more general question here is that of the common dilemma of specialization versus or depth versus breadth. Do you feel like sometimes you just don't really know either of the things you're talking about because you're comparing yourself to, not necessarily comparing yourself, but you're speaking to people who've spent 20 years on one thing, whereas you've spent, let's say, 10 on each. Just to give an example. Is that a problem to you, or do you think you just win more perspective?
I think it's the latter, actually. Mulling over it, maybe sound, certainly. So generally it's the latter, that you gain more perspective. I feel like that's the feeling I have, right? As to how it actually is, if someone metrically looked at it, it might be a different thing. But the area where maybe I feel I wish I had more time and more skill in was the analytical, that side. So I've been extremely fortunate again to have people who spent their career really thinking hard about analysis methods and so on that I just benefit from. So I have a whole range of it over my career of understanding what different ways you can look at data and tease it apart, and I read up on methods, but actually going into the fine detail of figuring out what is and isn't going to work and guiding a student directly through it. That's the area where I think that is increasingly hard. And I've certainly had supervisors throughout my career who also didn't have that skill. So someone like Neil Burgess is unusually amazing. He really does know these things, and it's really, so there's that kind of thing. But these things the landscape keeps changing. So even if you are utterly brilliant, you just do not have the time to sit down and really figure out. Often as a PI, you've got all those emails to answer that we started the podcast talking about. So that's probably the frustration of spreading. I think maybe one side of what I'm doing is that it does require changing hats a bit, and that has a cost. And so you kind of get caught up thinking, is this a project I should be involved in or not? Is this a risk to do this line of project down this? So yeah, it's hard. But I do see it. My intention is to completely continue doing cross-species work, but it does. It's entirely dependent upon funding bodies who allocate money to me to be successful enough at making both of that work. But we'll see. That's partly the challenge.
Yeah, let's see if you get your third species or fourth species on. I mean, it seems like you're going, further down the hierarchy of complexity, so to speak. I don't know, maybe one day you'll just be doing mold or something.
Yeah. That's slime mold has been on the one application in the past.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Slime molds can do some pretty impressive things. Yeah.
Yes, at some point you just stretch all families of living organisms or something.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned something earlier, which I think leads quite nicely to the final topic I want to talk about. And that's, you said, you're working to some extent on the integration of rodent and human work. And I think the review paper that I wanted to talk to you about is a pretty good example of that, because I guess you're kind of doing two things in that paper. The one is saying, we know all this literature from rodents. Does it also exist? Like, what do we know about humans, basically? And the other part is going from physical navigation to the more abstract cognitive maps. The paper I'm talking about is your 2017 review in Nature Neuroscience. And I guess I haven't mentioned this yet. For new listeners, I put references to all the papers we talk about in the description. So that will be in there. Maybe I'll start at a slightly... not random point, but yeah, slightly random point. So I was just curious. So you mentioned, 2005, there's the grid cell paper that came out. And then in 2008, Christian Döller, Casselberry, and Neil Burgess's paper came out showing that you can also find grid-like activity in humans. I'm just curious, what was that like for you when you were working on this kind of stuff? And especially because I guess you'd been in Neil Burgess's lab relatively recently before that, or maybe even at the time. How did you hear about this, and what did you think once they said, hey, we can actually do this in humans?
Oh, I was very excited to hear that. I remember, I was in UCL, so this was 2010, so I was in my fellowship and lectureship, and I remember hearing that they pulled this off and thinking, wow, that is very clever. That is a clever move.
Sorry, so as you were learning rodent stuff, because you wanted to grid cells.
It came out the year I'd switched to being a lecturer. But
so then they showed actually you don't need rodents.
I didn't say that. I mean, that paper is a good point, but that paper includes a whole lot of rodent analysis from Caswell. Mm-hmm. So he looked to prove one of the reasons it's a great paper is that it is genuinely a combination of recording in rodents and showing you get these patterns, and then let's go look at the fMRI signal. And it has been replicated in a number of cases. And of course, crucially, Josh Jacobs had a Nature Neuroscience paper showing he could get grid-like patterns in from single units in humans recorded from patients. So it has been followed up. And there's a number of, follow-up impressive studies taking this line. It was a real thing in UCL. And of course, the thing you'll go on to consider is what's described often as the stretchy birds paper. Constantine Eku and in Tim Barron's lab. And she did an amazing job with that paper. And that was a real... I think at that point I was like, I can't quite believe this. not as in a skeptical, like, these are bad scientists pulling something off, but this is a real step change.
I mean, were you thinking about this at the time? Like, I wonder if I can get grids out in humans?
I think I hadn't been thinking about this perspective at that point when that work had just come out. I hadn't even, when this line of thinking emerged, I was unaware that Tolman back in the 1930s had actually first described, rats navigating a maze as an example, but he'd considered that the cognitive map might extend more generally, that it was even in Tolman's original thinking. But I was always aware, I was always aware as even as a sort of young PhD student reading The Cognitive Map by John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadell, that in chapter 13 of that book, they go wild and expand the ideas into language. And it's an incredible chapter, a piece of writing in 1978 that predates all this work, thinking about how the map might extend beyond space. So a lot of this thinking was sitting there for a very long time, 1930s, 1970s. And our reason it was swept away is the precision of the spatial coding has just been phenomenal. And that place cell literature is just so exciting and evocative that it took precedence over this angle. In that review in 2017, Russell Epstein, Josh Gillian, and Zita Patai, we were looking to put forward the argument that we've got a lot of good evidence now in 2017 of similarity across humans and rodents. But like you said, where does this go beyond space,
Yeah. So I guess in that paper, the three main points that you highlight also in the abstract are basically that the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex support this map-like codes. Then you have parahippocampal and retrosplenial cortices help anchor maps to environmental landmarks. And then frontal lobes are used to plan routes. So you kind of have this, if you want to put it this way, at the back of the brain, you kind of have sensory inputs that create a map and fixate it. At the front, you have the planning into whatever you want to do. In the middle, you have the map itself. And because we're slightly running short of time, I think maybe we can, I guess, kind of skip the spatial stuff. I mean, I've had quite a few episodes already on what grid cells are and place cells are and that kind of stuff, and maybe go straight towards the more abstract stuff. Before we do that, I have just one question, which is something that I don't actually know the answer to. What exactly is the difference between a boundary vector cell and a border cell? I just read that somewhere in your thing, and I thought, wait a minute, what is the difference? I thought they were the same.
That was discussed on Twitter recently with a back and forward dialogue.
Oh, really?
It goes back to what you're analyzing in the data. So the boundary vector cell, as described by Neil Burgess when he postulated they exist, are cells that fire when a boundary, a wall, or some feature that restricts movement is at a particular distance and orientation in the cardinal or the allocentric space. So I walk into a room and there's a wall that's 2 meters to the southwest of me. There'll be a border cell that gets excited by this feature. And it doesn't matter where I go in the world, it gets excited by a wall 2 meters to the southwest. That's a particular boundary vector cell. Boundary cells, as described by the Mosers in their paper, were cells where you're quite proximal to the boundary. You had to be close to it, and that were not so vector driven. So when I'm near boundaries, they would fire. They may be more modulated by boundaries in some directions, but generally these cells are thought to fire. The thinking is they're probably something very similar. It's just the way they've been analysed and presented. But for simplicity, people often say border cells and boundary vector cells. And maybe one way of thinking is that border cells are a subclass of boundary vector cells. But I think that maybe even that's too simplistic. Just be a bit careful.
Yeah. It's just, I guess, for me, this is something I'm really interested in, but something I don't always read too carefully. So whenever I read like boundary or something, for me, that was just the same thing. Until you kind of put them side by side or something, I was like, wait a minute. So from this very specific question, I have a more general question about the metaphor of a cognitive map. Because I think one thing that's easy to forget when you kind of get swept up in spatial navigation and there's a cognitive map and all this stuff is that the map is, of course, a metaphor. And I'm not criticizing metaphors. They're very useful and it's basically impossible to think without them. But I was just curious, what do you think are some potential problems with this metaphor? So, we think of a map and then I often imagine a physical map, let's say, of London in front of me, and then you can use that to create new ideas or whatever. But where do you think this metaphor breaks down for space or even for abstract things? And what problems might it cause in terms of people thinking too closely in terms of the metaphor rather than the thing they're actually trying to study?
Yeah, no, it's a core. It's one of these slightly deeper, important questions in the field about how the language we use then impacts the kind of way we interpret the data. And it's a good one to have. It's good to think about. I'm always aware. I mean, I think I've always, since reading about it, conceived of, if you go back to the place cells and the first suggestions, how you link brain activity to a map. So that very long 500-page book by John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadell lays out the case from the 1970s as why you would use the map metaphor to describe place cells. And the idea therein is there's a sort of moving bump of activity in this bit of the brain that is a kind of you are here point. It's constantly roving round. So it's not as you said, it's not something that can be conceived in one image. It's a thing. It's a kind of a signal that allows spaces to be integrated. So even at the understanding of what the cells are doing, it is a challenge. It's something I've been keen to actually write more generally. I don't think there's a good article out there. I mean, if you've been studying, thinking about this as well, you could point me to there. But I haven't come across one that really tries to outline how this is operating for a general reader, because it isn't true. You say, the brain has a map in it. Yeah, and there's these place cells, but what does that mean? And your question is getting to that metaphor idea. So it's not a map in the sense of a cartographic one. It's a system for mapping space, but it's not an egocentric one. It's an allocentric one. And then when you start to get to that, what's allocentric is the other-centered. It's fixed on the environment. That is kind of a map as we understand maps. So I'm reusing the words and not really defining them and getting you much further in that, but I'm going through my thinking. One of the most important features of the debate around this, and I've written about it, I wrote a short commentary in Ticks, a spotlight, which I entitled something like, I should go back and check what the title was, but it was trying to be a bit provocative, like, is there a universal map? Like, is there actually a general cognitive map? I got a bit frustrated by slightly lazy thinking in some of the papers I'd read, so I went back and highlighted. It's a small number of citations in there. What I highlight in that, and go back to your question, is the distinction between physical spaces where you can have vectors. I can choose a million ways to move across the room, and I can think about the Euclidean geometry to solve problems in space, is different to a social network or a stimulus network or anything that isn't actually set within a real space. It's connected by gradients. And you can, going back to, say, the Stretchy Birds paper, which we didn't walk our way through, but this idea of you can have and there's some lovely work by Christian Dohler's lab as well, extending that to hippocampal activity. You can have a kind of continuous stimulus space, but a lot of the world is not necessarily like that. Semantic knowledge is not so smooth. So this lack of smoothness and Euclidean space is a really interesting feature of that. There's a nice paper as well by Michael Peer and others, including Russell Epstein, Nora Newcomb, and Eva Berneck, I think, are the authors, on cognitive maps and cognitive graphs. So that even in space, I haven't read that does everyone actually build a map? And the data suggests some people are more graph-like in the way they build their understanding of space. So even in physical space, there are questions about the way it's represented. Is it truly map-like? So I think these are all questions. At the heart of my short review, I was really postulating that it's really attractive to have this universal cognitive map perspective that Tim Behrens and many others have put forward. But it struck me that there are enough differences between navigating a social network and a physical space, and fundamental differences in them, that it seems plausible the brain may have specialized the hippocampus in some ways, in particular data on lateralization in patients, where you tend to get, certainly the work I started in my career, right lateralized temporal lobectomies result in quite severe damage in navigation ability. But if you damage the left hemisphere, you don't get these same effects. They're pretty normal. And this goes back to Brenda Milner and Case HM. She was doing a lot of unilateral temporal lobectomy work, similar story. So if that's true, it may be that the brain has slightly specialized systems within. There isn't one universal map that just does everything. It can do space. Like the equivalency of space to other features is maybe overblown, was my thought. But I think what we wrote in that 2017 paper, I would stand by, and many people have argued, is that if you look at the hippocampus and the way it's structured anatomically and physiologically, and the fact that we know it's needed for these things, this social navigation, then it seems extremely likely that there's a universal computation that's developed as vertebrates. We've developed this hippocampus to navigate spaces, but also life. Neil Cohen and Howard Eichenbaum, I don't know, like hippocampus is not just for navigating space, but for navigating life, was the argument made. Which I thought it was too vague. But this precision of saying you can have a grid-like codes for non-spatial that Tim Behrens has developed in his papers, and there's other nice work from Dori Dudikman that kicked off some of this before. That's really like taken us in some really nice directions for thinking about how computations from spatial coding could be used in non-spatial spaces. But there's a really great question about this vectors and how our brain deals with the smooth planes versus grid-like environments or grid-like structures of knowledge.
Yeah. Then there's, of course, fairly recently the Nature paper by the Mosas about the torus. I haven't read it yet, but that seems to, I don't know exactly what it does, but it seems like that's changing quite a bit how we think about grid cells anyway. But yeah, I mean, I didn't also want to, I'm not criticizing the metaphor itself, and I think it can be really useful to say, and that's maybe the last thing we can end on, is then what are, for example, landmarks in abstract conceptual space? Because that's something that to some extent makes sense to think about it that way, but it doesn't always lend itself to an obvious answer. And sometimes I'm wondering, is that because I just can't see what it is, or does it just not exist? So maybe about the question of what a landmark in abstract conceptual space is, maybe briefly, we use landmarks to navigate, and maybe what are some of the key features of a landmark, and how does that maybe help us understand what landmarks would be in conceptual space?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually a question I've never heard posed before, which is really nice. It may have been posed in, you've been running over a recent book, thinking about these metaphors more, but So I don't have a really great answer for that as well, because I was just thinking about the nice work by Mike Kahner's lab, University of Pennsylvania, I think he's in, where you're looking at vector word space, the word to vec, estimates of relationships between words. So you can move in these different multidimensional word spaces for semantic knowledge. But what's a landmark? As you said, you're moving along these dimensions. So I'm going down here and I'm going to take a left on that plane. What would provide a landmark to allow you to turn left to the next word orientation in the word space? I think you're right. The first step is it doesn't seem like there's an obvious, correlate of that going into this abstract space for that phenomenon. There may be in other scenarios, there may be aspects. One thing we've been playing with and I'd love to play more with is the graph structure. So properties of graphs. So when you think about, really central nodes, like in a city, there'll be a central roundabout or somewhere like in London, Leicester Square or Oxford Circus, where they're really important points where multiple roads come together. That also will exist in social networks. There's just that one person who knows everyone. They're really connected. They're a really important node. And so there's interesting aspects of looking at that. That isn't landmarks. That isn't answering your question directly, but it's highlighting there are some shared features of the way physical and non-physical spaces have nodes and important properties within the space. That's
it seems to me also it just really depends on the context you're looking at. In some, it's fairly obvious. There's also I've talked to Jakob Belmont on the podcast and about his review paper. And since then, now I've read Peter Ganfoss's book, Conceptual Spaces. And I think that, obviously can't summarize it here, but I think that kind of the idea of having stereotypes or prototypes of different concepts goes maybe somewhat towards that direction. And there's, I found Peter Gettenfoss's book really interesting, and I think there's lots of stuff to be done that he kind of just briefly mentions here and there. So in some contexts it is quite obvious, but in others it feels like the whole thing might not even work, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a hot topic in neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience is understanding more about this. A lot of people are very excited about the extension of models and ways of thinking about space into non-space and exploiting all the mathematics people have described in the rodent field of spatial navigation. So many ways of analyzing. So I think that's what's driving some of this.
Yeah. It's funny, I've mentioned this before in one of the interviews, but I remember when I took NeoWidgets in Caswell Barry's course, I felt like, they figured this out. Like, there's grid cell, this place. So I was, okay, we don't quite know how it works, but we've pretty much figured it out. But then, it's just the start. There's still a lot of interesting stuff to be done.
Oh, for sure.